Hi there, and welcome back to Energy Flux On Air. I'm your host, Seb Kennedy, founding editor of Energy Flux, the independent newsletter analysing European natural gas markets and global geopolitics. But I must start this episode with an apology. It's been far too long since the last edition. It's been an insanely busy summer of travel, conference reporting, networking events, and most exciting of all, building major new expansions to the Energy Flux platform. I'll talk about some of that at the end, but what I thought would be really useful and interesting for listeners is to talk through the many layers of significance to today's Alaska summit between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Trump is, of course, flying to Anchorage to host a high-level Russian delegation. The American president said earlier in the week that he was, quote, flying to Russia, which is amusing because Alaska, lest we forget, used to be Russian territory until Emperor Alexander II sold it to the United States in the year 1867 for the princely sum of $7.2 million. That's about $160 million in today's money. It's a real steal because if you put it in perspective, the GDP of Alaska is today about $70 billion. So that Alaska transaction, that really was the real estate deal of the century, and one that even the greatest real estate tycoon of them all, Mr. Donald Trump, has yet to surpass. Maybe I'm being premature. Maybe Trump will pull off a phenomenal deal. All the indicators are that some sort of land swap deal could be on the table. But this is a deal that would be phenomenal for Russia and probably absolutely terrible for Ukraine, which by extension means terrible for the security arrangements of the whole of Europe. Among the many possible deals floated around ahead of today's meeting, and I won't go through them all because others have done a thorough job of analysing the options, there have been reports of an Alaskan minerals deal for Putin. This would involve granting access to mineral rights in Alaska for Russian companies and entities to exploit. This, frankly, preposterous idea inspired the title of this post and this podcast, Make Alaska Russian Again, or MARA. It's kind of catchy, don't you think? Well, you heard it here first. Anyway, Vladimir Putin didn't invade Russia in order to extract Alaskan mineral rights out of the White House. No, he wants Ukraine itself. Now, nobody knows what Trump will do, least of all himself, sometimes it seems. But he might offer major territorial concessions from Ukraine in return for a ceasefire. A pause in hostilities is obviously not in Ukraine's interests, because by definition, it means a subsequent resumption in Russian aggression somewhere down the line, unless further concessions are made to Moscow. It really would be quite phenomenal for an American president to make such a concession in return for allowing Russia to regroup and rearm before continuing its mission to take the whole of Ukraine by force. But that is the grim reality we could be looking at. The other major lever at Trump's disposal is sanctions relief, or the flip side of that, tightening of sanctions against Russia. This is where it's particularly relevant to energy markets because traders and market participants are trying to price in the likelihood of a relaxation of the Biden-era Russian sanctions regime, which currently, among other things, prevents the Arctic LNG-2 liquefied natural gas project in Siberia from operating at full capacity. Those measures are inhibiting LNG export logistics by constraining Russia's access to cryogenic vessels and deterring buyers from off-taking LNG from the plant. So relaxing those sanctions would allow Arctic LNG-2 to ramp up output and offload gas or liquefied natural gas that it's already produced, which is in storage, which nobody wants to buy, because they would potentially be slapped with sanctions. If that gas could reach the market, it would augment an already enormous wave of new LNG supply that is literally starting to break onto global gas markets as we speak. Natural gas prices on EU-traded hubs and in the Asian LNG spot market are already notably soft amid rising supply overhang and lackluster demand. So any hint of sanctions relief for Russian LNG would in all likelihood, trigger an even deeper sell-off in European and Asian gas futures. However, I must say I'm dubious about whether this will be forthcoming, and it could even turn the other way, i.e. there could, in some circumstances, be a tightening of the sanctions or perhaps the tariff regime towards Russia. The reasons I say that is that the US Senate is sitting on an extensive Russian secondary sanctions bill that targets Moscow and its allies in China and other countries that buy Russian oil exports and therefore fund Russian aggression in Ukraine. Trump has shown he is willing to turn the tariffs screw, for example, on India for buying sanctioned Russian crude oil. I expect Trump will probably keep sanctions relief in his back pocket as a useful carrot if he needs it. And we all know that Trump loves offering Putin carrots, and he's less keen on hitting him with sticks, which is a shame because the threat of tariffs is a handy stick. Let's not forget, the only country in the world that has not been hit with Trump's frankly insane Independence Day trade tariffs was, yes, Russia, which really speaks for itself. So to sum up in very broad terms, abominable land swap and grotesque minerals deal for Putin, yes/maybe. Sanctions relief for Russia, no, or at least not yet. We shall see. The broader geopolitical panorama for this summit I find absolutely fascinating. And the reason I say that is that Armenia and Azerbaijan signed a landmark peace deal just this past weekend. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it's literally only about 6 days ago. The presidents of both of those countries flew to Washington for the signing ceremony and said they would nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, the prestige award that is coveted by the world's most powerful narcissist. The peace deal is hugely significant for Russia, perhaps more than anybody else, because for decades, if not centuries, Russia was the guarantor of Armenian security and the undisputed great power that had the final say over regional affairs in the South Caucasus. So for Trump to come along and broker a peace deal between two ex-Soviet states that have been at each other's throats pretty much since the fall of the Soviet Union and are fresh out of an incredibly bloody war over the Nagorno-Karabakh region is quite an achievement. And the fact that Trump enters the Alaska summit with the ink on that peace accord barely dry will be a great humiliation for Putin. While Russia has been distracted, waging a war of aggression in Ukraine, and a futile one at that, Trump has achieved peace in Russia's own backyard. It's quite the contrast, isn't it? Trump the peacemaker, Putin the warmonger. Anyway, there is one important unresolved element of the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace accord, and that is the thorny question of how to manage what is known as the Zangezur corridor. Now, if you're not familiar with this, then go find a map of Azerbaijan. You will see it is split into two. There's what's known as mainland Azerbaijan, which borders the Caspian Sea, which I visited on a reporting assignment for Energy Flux just a couple of months back. And there's the landlocked exclave of Nakhchivan, which is also Azerbaijani territory, bordered by Iran to the south, Armenia to the north and east, and Turkey through a very, very small strip of land to the west. Between those two bits of Azerbaijan sits Armenia. And one of the things they have been fighting over all these years is who gets to control the strip of land that divides Azerbaijan, called the Zangezur corridor. It's a 40-ish kilometer stretch of highly strategic land in the South Caucasus. Now, I flagged to Energy Flux readers earlier this year, after my reporting trip to Baku, that the Zangezur corridor could be the next geopolitical flashpoint. And I must say, the way that the Trump administration is handling this delicate issue certainly seems to be aggravating matters. Because as part of the peace accord, American companies are being lined up to operate the Zangezur corridor and even rename it, and I'm not kidding, the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, or TRIP for short. The TRIP project could unleash a highly profitable new Eurasian trade route that cuts transit times for goods traveling between Asia and Europe. And those goods could, in some vision of the future, include energy, or more specifically, oil and gas, if new pipeline capacity could be built in the region, a peace pipeline of sorts. That prize is still a long way off, but what's most telling in all of this, which I gleaned from talking to one of my regional diplomatic sources this week, is that Trump's man in Istanbul, Tom Barrack, the US ambassador to Turkey and special envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, he proposed a 100-year lease of the Zangezur corridor to the US in order to make this trip route fantasy a reality. The lease idea was immediately rejected by the Armenian side because they are fresh out of a bloody years-long conflict over the sovereignty of this land, and they categorically will not consider leasing it to a third nation under any circumstances. So it is back to the drawing board on that one. What this tells us is that the Trump administration really does approach diplomacy as if it were the same as real estate deal-making. I mean, for a Manhattan real estate mogul, the idea of a land lease makes perfect sense. You know, one side gets money, the other gets control, everybody happy, sign on the dotted line, let's go and drink some champagne. But diplomacy doesn't work like that. It's fundamentally not the same as real estate. The idea of America leasing the Zangezur corridor from Armenia was never going to fly. And the Trump administration might have known this. And Tom Barrack, the ambassador, might have avoided making a fool of himself in these talks if the US side had approached the matter from a diplomatic angle, rather than the sort of transactional attitude of hip-shooting real estate big shots. So it's worth adding also that this sort of expertise and diplomatic insights would have been more readily available to the Trump administration if they hadn't gutted the National Security Council earlier this year in their attempt to purge government of anyone who is not blindly loyal to the president. But I digress. This is really, in the grand scheme of things, a minor detail because the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace deal still stands, and it will be a major irritant to Vladimir Putin as he seeks to push home his advantage in Ukraine, in the form perhaps of a sweetheart deal brokered by Trump, the great peacemaker, or should that be the great appeaser? And all of this is before we even get into the topic of Russian pipeline gas supplies to Europe, which could also come back onto the table at some point during the quote-unquote peace process, regardless of the European Union's dogged determination to ban Russian energy imports from 2027. But that's a topic and a level of detail that I do not expect to be discussed in today's high-stakes Alaska meeting. So we'll soon see what sort of ghastly giveaway comes out of Anchorage today. And I will be tuned to the news wires and probably dipping into social media to share a few thoughts as things unfold. Now, before I sign off, as I mentioned at the start, I just wanted to bring listeners up to speed on what's been a real non-stop summer of growth and development for Energy Flux. Aside from that really very memorable reporting trip to Azerbaijan, which produced a scoop in the Telegraph, a big Q&A with a very senior executive from Azerbaijan's state oil and gas company SOCAR, and a very long multimedia report of Baku Energy Week. Apart from all of that, I've also been busy developing the Energy Flux platform itself. So it evolved from being just a newsletter hosted on the Ghost open source platform to something of a kind of community system or ecosystem. I've launched the Energy Flux Exchange just a couple of weeks back. This is a members-only discussion forum hosted on Discourse, which is another open source platform. And free readers have access to the Flux Exchange, limited access, I should say, while paid subscribers unlock special private channels to discuss the ins and outs of the market and to have sort of back channel editorial conversations and shape the direction of the Energy Flux newsletter. So there's this kind of symbiotic community relationship with the newsletter, which is very exciting and very much in its earliest embryonic stages, but promises great things down the line. Now, the Flux Exchange is special not just because of that, but because within Flux Exchange, within the forum, is hosted a new product called Flux Briefing, That is an AI-generated daily news update on energy markets with a special focus on natural gas, LNG, and geopolitics, my favorite topics. And the briefing was developed in partnership with a very sophisticated AI developer called SentryDot. And it's remarkable. And I speak honestly and from the heart here that it's becoming now my go-to source of news. Because every morning about 6 a.m. UK time, then the AI monitoring tool that SentryDoc has developed and configured for Energy Flux, it puts out this very eloquent, very concise briefing with lots of embedded headlines and well-crafted narrative that links together developments happening both in like kind of infrastructure, investment, prices, geopolitics, everything that could kind of essentially shape the market or shape market sentiment over the coming days, weeks, months, or even years. It's a short read, but it's kind of very dense and very, very high value. The great thing, if you're listening to this and you're not already getting Flux Briefing, is that it's free. So all you have to do is go to www.energyflux.news, sign up for a free account, and then head on over to the Flux Briefing, which is hosted on the Flux Exchange. And there are links on the website to all of those things. Now, as if that wasn't enough, I've also been developing the core product, which is the newsletter itself, and some fairly sophisticated data tools that help Energy Flux subscribers understand where the European gas market is heading. So these are the TTF sentiment tracker, which tracks the relationship between speculative capital and weekly price movements on the Dutch title transfer facility, being the most heavily traded of the European gas hubs and the kind of benchmark pricing for European gas, and the TTF risk model, which is a kind of even more clever monitoring tool, which takes cues from not only the investment funds, but also the commercial undertakings and the curve slope, that's the term structure of TTF gas futures, to deliver a kind of signal score, which tells you kind of in which direction the market's moving in, what phase of the cycle it could be at, and to really signpost where prices are most likely to move over the kind of short to medium term. And both of those things, the TTF sentiment tracker and the TTF risk model, they are the two core planks of the chart deck. And that's a newsletter piece that I publish in Energy Flux every week or every 2 weeks, depending on how much market movement has been. These two tools, the tracker and the model, both of which are in the chart deck, they provide decision critical signals about market sentiment, directionality, momentum, and how each category of market participant perceives and prices risk on the Dutch TTF from 1 week to the next. So like I said, head on over to www.energyflux.news for more information on all of that. And if you want to get ahead in these crazy markets, then take out a free trial of the premium product, Energy Flux. Thanks for listening. See you next time.